Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and LEAP, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test school and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is Division III and Ivy League athletic recruitment. But first, let's meet our special guest, Matt Arant.
Prior to founding Arant Academic Planning, Matt Arant worked as an admissions representative at Franklin and Marshall College, serving as the primary athletics liaison for the Office of Admission and working closely with over 24 intercollegiate sports throughout the entire application cycle. He has presented on college athletic recruitment and the admissions process across the country, and is an active member of NACAC and the Texas Association for College Admissions Counseling. He is also a member of IECA. Welcome.
Thank you.
Matt, great to have you on the show to talk about a topic that many of our listeners are always asking questions about, especially being specific about Division III and Ivy League athletic recruitment. Before we get into that, we'd love to hear about your history and how you came to specialize in this particular aspect of college consulting.
Great. So probably the best place to start is my own personal experience. And not too long ago, but long enough ago, I was a Division III athlete myself. I played tennis at a small liberal arts college in Arkansas, which afforded me a lot of opportunities to not only compete at that level athletically, but contribute to campus in a wide variety of ways, whether it was being a residential assistant, a student government senator, various club leadership roles, both athletically and socially, which would not really be possible if I went to a high-powered D1 school. And to be honest, I didn't have the talent to even make that a conversation starter. But having that ability to not only play a sport at that level, but also contribute to campus in a variety of ways really led me to find my own path in the educational space. So I previously worked at Franklin and Marshall College, as we mentioned earlier, kind of your quintessential D3 Northeast liberal arts college, all undergrad, under 2,000 students. I worked with all of our sports. It was about 27 to 28 that were mostly D3. We had one Division I school, which was wrestling. And in this role, I worked with all the coaches. So that was kind of being an intermediary between the admissions office as well as the athletics department. And so I was there for 5 years, both on campus and most recently regionally based, because I was hired right when the pandemic was about to start. So I had both time in Lancaster, where the campus is located, and then the last 2 years in Austin, Texas, where I am currently, being that regionally based representative. So that led me to think about specializing in D3 athletics, because I came from that world personally as well as professionally.
So when you got into sort of admissions, was your desire to be more in the admission space or the athletic space? I'm curious.
It was more admissions, because coming to that from an outsider perspective, because most admission folks are either direct alums of the college they work for or from the area. And I was neither of those. I was from Texas, and I was at a school in eastern central Pennsylvania. There's not a whole lot of traditional pipelines geographically there. And I didn't go to the college itself, but I heard about it from other folks, because going back to my time as a tennis player myself, I was able to teach tennis at summer camps in the Northeast, where the students and families, F&M was one of those schools that they knew very well. So that was my first exposure that way. And admissions to me allowed me to understand the school as a whole, because you're an external spokesperson for that school, which means you have to know kind of the ins and outs of everything on campus, not just one office.
I want to lead with that because when I think of athletes pursuing, playing in college, I know we often try to understand like how much is the admissions office involved and aware of that athlete being an athlete versus how much is it the coaches. So can you tell us a little bit about like who is an athletic admission liaison and what is it that they're doing, especially because how is that important for a student to understand that person's role?
So yes, so that's basically going to be more confined to the Division III and what we kind of call high academic Division I schools. So your Ivy League schools, your Patriot League, some schools like Davidson, which isn't in neither of those conferences, but they have that same academic profile as a Patriot League
Who
school.
are some of the schools in the Patriot League?
Yeah, so your service academies, Bucknell, Lafayette, Lehigh, Boston University, Holy Cross, schools like that. And I kind of use the NESCAC and Centennial as a D3 kind of mirror of that. NESCAC is the Division III version of the Ivy League, New England, small liberal arts colleges, whereas a Patriot League maybe a bit larger and more confined to the Mid-Atlantic than the North, than the New England itself. Those are kind of the two main conferences there. Athletics liaisons usually exist at those schools because the admission process is not as cut and dry as, say, a traditional D1 school. I think we have some resources about the eligibility center that we'll have available later, in which for Division I athletes, you have to have a certain GPA, not even test scores anymore, because now they went optional due to COVID, and then you have to take a certain number of core courses, fulfill those requirements, you're pretty much done for D1 and D2. D3 is different because you actually have to go through the school itself because no athletic scholarships are given. So that's what makes an athletics liaison very important to both an admissions office as well as an athletics department because they're working between those two offices.
So I just want to emphasize what you said and make sure that this is clear. Division III athletes do not receive athletic scholarships.
No, they do not. But they
Right.
they
Okay.
all also but they're all eligible to receive other forms of financial aid. And in fact, they receive
Oh.
more financial aid on average than athletic scholarships at Division I schools that aren't football. And there's only a few sports at D1 that awards full athletic scholarships. So that's kind of a big myth around D1
I
athletics.
was going to say there's just a misperception about if you're
Yeah.
an athlete getting a full ride. And I think the clarification here is that it would depend if you're D1 or D2, that's possible. But at D3, you are not technically given a full ride purely based upon your athletic ability.
Yes, it's more tied to financial need and or academic prowess.
And so it makes it interesting for students because they really have to sort of have the academic chops at D3, especially if they're really selective. And then the athletic piece actually that becomes an advantage. I mean, it can be an advantage, right, at those
Mhm.
schools, having that academic ability
Yes.
to be able to play on a team at that school.
Because admission officers use the term like hook. It's like an extra, I guess an intangible is probably the most, like the closest kind of one-to-one in which it's not apparent on a GPA or a score sheet or financial profile that this person has this in addition to the academic profile.
Yeah, it's being able to play a sport at a high level is a very big hook because it fits the institutional priorities that colleges have. They want to field a baseball team, they want to field a basketball team, and they need people to do that and hopefully win.
Well, Matt, I want you to see if you might dispel an understanding that I've often had, which is that when my kids were little, I was like, should I make them a squash player? Should I make them a fencer to give them some special athletic hook at some of these institutions where we know we don't see many squash players, we don't see many fencers.
Well, that kind of leads to another sort of, I guess, tangent to go off because on the one hand, that might give some additional hooks. Those sports are nowhere near the number of represented schools as like football or
Sure.
basketball or lacrosse. Furthermore, those more international sports are international for a reason, so they're more likely to have international recruits come play those sports than students that are based in the U.S. So there's some kind of push and pull with those more specialized
What
sports
about
compared to
crew?
your classic
I always
basketball.
heard that crew is a good one
I think that's
for the
so
kind of
big. And
schools we're talking about.
yeah, but crew is so big now
Yeah.
in a way that's not unusual, where I
Mhm.
would say like squash or fencing is far more unusual.
And Cruz has a much larger roster, and most of the schools have kind of they divide it up into ability, right? It's not just your start. You only have like four slots for a crew.
Right.
You could have a bunch more that has like your light boat, there are much more classifications than just it's just five or six recruits coming in each year for that sport.
That's fantastic. So, kind of walk us through the difference. I think that the public at large has a sense about being a recruited student athlete from the very pinnacle of being like a highly coveted four-star recruit for Division I football or basketball. They get all the
Mhm.
press.
Yeah.
What is the reality for the students that might be pursuing D3 or Ivy League athletics?
It depends on the sport. So if you think about kind of the revenue generating sports, so football, men's and women's basketball, those are kind of the big three. D1 versus D3, there is a vast difference in ability. It's more like size based, right? So you think about a D1 basketball player that plays at Duke, for example, versus a D3 player who's at NYU, which is a top ranked D3 basketball program. There's a wide gulf of difference in size, speed, ability. But contrast that to other sports, so like lacrosse or field hockey or sports like that, tennis, where the top D3 kids, they get offers from D1 schools and they choose D3 because it's a stronger academic fit and it's a smaller environment and they're not going to have to travel across country twice a week to compete.
That's very interesting. So, okay, so the revenue generators that you're talking about, the sports where there is a gulf
Yeah.
between D1 and the rest would be basketball, football, men's and
Maybe hockey.
women's
Yeah, maybe
basketball,
hockey more or less, because those are
hockey.
like the where the size really makes the difference. And
Sure.
whereas those other sports that you can kind of get away with, like the top D3 lacrosse players, they use up their eligibility D3 and then they might do another year at a D1 school. It's not
Okay.
uncommon to have someone transfer after they graduate from the D3 school to a school that offers grad programs which they can still play at that D1
Oh.
level too.
Where does baseball fit?
It's it's more mixed, I guess. You have some players that can kind of travel between those worlds, but baseball, there's so many prospects out there. The MLB draft is 50 plus rounds as opposed to football, which is I believe six or seven. So they're just the amount of prospects is so vast for baseball. You might have a
Right.
D3 kid that gets drafted by the MLB in a mid to late round, whereas basketball, I don't remember the last time a D3 player
Right. It's
was
always
drafted.
going to be D1.
It might be a D1 transfer
In the
from a
football,
D3 school.
interestingly, in
Yeah.
football, in the 7 rounds of the draft, students from different conferences and D3 schools might get drafted. Okay, so that's one of the big differences. But if you're in a sport that isn't one of the top revenue generators, you can kind of move around. You can consider D1, D3, D2, like all of that.
Mhm.
Is there anything else in terms of the way, say, coaches actively recruit players that differs between the divisions?
Yeah, so probably how to answer that is more compliance based. So for coaches that contact players, there's a certain date in which you can't do anything prior to that. It's usually uh end of sophomore rising junior year over the summer. I think it's June 15th is usually that date for D1 and D2 in which the coaches can contact players. Players themselves can reach out to coaches whenever, right? It's just a matter of from the coaches to initiate conversation. For D1 and D2, it's usually that summer at the end of their sophomore year. D3, because there aren't the scholarships, like I mentioned, that's kind of the linchpin that ultimately defines those three divisions is awarding scholarships based upon athletic ability, right? So that's the main difference there is just the overall timelines. And it's going to be later for D3 as opposed to D1 and D2 because of those offers being given by coaches themselves.
And that kind of raises when we're talking about timeline. So if you are an athlete, you really do need to start thinking, you know, in your sophomore year then
Mhm.
about
Yes.
what schools you're interested in or potentially where might I play, right? Because it's not like just because you're an athlete, you can go anywhere. Like I remember a cousin of mine who was a football player, and especially in sports where there's positions,
Yeah.
you might be interested in a school where they're not looking necessarily to fill spots for that position. So
Yeah.
that might not be the school for you simply because of, you're not gonna check that box for them.
Yeah.
I recall this was probably 6 or more years ago, where lacrosse coaches in particular were notorious for asking students for test scores in their 10th grade. Like you have to
Yes,
get the
that
scores. And I feel
Mhm.
like that's changed. When you alluded to the changes in the regulations and what coaches are able to do, how has that changed that that level of aggression from some coaches?
I don't think it really has changed in terms of like coaches contacting players and players contacting coaches for sports like lacrosse. So when I was at F&M, when I would do pre-reads, which is kind of the primary focus of a liaison, is you offer preliminary evaluations of a student based upon GPA, test scores, course rigor in some cases, financial profile, other things like that. That's where that document comes into play. And for certain sports, lacrosse is one of them, field hockey, soccer, baseball, and football kind of is constantly throughout the cycle. It's not early or late. Those sports, I would get periods from them right when the window opened. Whereas other sports,
And when does the window open for a student?
after
it
soft.
depends.
Oh,
So the NESCAC, like I mentioned earlier, it's like the D3 liberal arts colleges. They have a conference-wide agreement in which I think it's July 1st is the earliest date in which a pre-read can be requested by a coach. I think
July
during
1st of going into what year?
event of their senior year. So
Of their
rising
senior, so
seniors,
not
end
even
of
junior year,
yeah,
of their senior year. So
of
that changes
officially
things dramatically.
yeah. So officially for the pre-read, that's the official metric, but NESCAC and Centennial and other conferences that compete at the highest levels D3, they've already identified a lot of their prospects way before the pre-read comes about. And more savvy coaches have a sense of the academic profile and financial profile of those student athletes long before the pre-read is
And they're
requested.
able to signal to the students and their parents, listen, like we have before the pre-read, they can say, you're going to need this grade, this
Mhm.
test score for me to get you through.
Yeah, saying, oh, you need a certain amount of rigor, some strong scores.
right.
Don't
But if
take
you're
senior year
reading
off.
that before
Yeah,
your senior year of high school, you can't change almost any of those things.
No, no, no. What he's saying is that the coaches can talk to them before the official pre-read and help them prepare. And we see this all the time. We see the coaches saying, "Listen, we'd love for you to play, but we need, your grades are not there. Or you need to be accelerated in this subject."
But after sophomore, you can change some of those things. After
That's what I'm saying.
junior year, other than a test score, that's the only lever you have prior to senior year.
and that's the importance of students recruiting, recruits going to showcases, ID clinics. That's where they have the one-on-one conversation with the coaches
Correct.
in which that can occur.
Because that's, I think, what you're talking about, Mike. Because I had a basketball player, I think, for Harvard, where we actually, contrary to our policy of working with sophomores,
Right.
we did work with her because she said Harvard needs to see a score as early as possible so that they could really sort of like they want me because they know I'm the athlete they want and I got the test score they want,
I
right?
just feel
Yeah.
like that doesn't happen as often as it used to. We had that happen a lot with students.
COVID, and I know, Matt, what your observations are. Obviously, all these schools went test optional during COVID, but they're all
They're coming
returning.
back though. Yeah.
Yeah, they're
They've
coming back.
all, almost all of them have returned to tests required. So now that probably is like a huge shift that's changed. But back in the day, I remember that 28 ACT was like a magic number. If you were being
Mhm.
recruited, like, can you just try to have your ACT above a 28 or whatever? That was, I don't know if that's the case anymore, but that was a magic number years ago for most of my like student athletes.
Matt, can I ask specifically, since we're talking about test scores? What I
Mhm.
noticed during the pandemic was that as a lot of schools went test optional, many coaches went against their institution's policies and started and required by surprise. We had seniors that were surprised that their coaches said, no, you need this score. Even though the school is test optional, you need this score. So it feels to me like coaches have themselves been more aggressive in setting standards for
Mhm.
test scores for the athletes that they're recruiting. Is that just my perspective anecdotally, or are you seeing that trend?
I think it might be bigger anecdotally than we might think. So if you think about it, a student athlete has the athletic fit the strength there. And then they have a test score that's within the school's profile, if test optional or not, that's going to put them well above most of the applicants because as these test optional schools continue that way, the percentage of students submitting is plummeting, right? But if you have an athlete that's oftentimes unfairly associated with weaker applicants overall compared to non-athletes,
Hmm.
if you have those markers of strong GPA profile within the profile of the school's test scores, that's going to be a monumental positive when the pre-read comes and then hopefully for the admission decision too. So I think coaches understand that the test score is for the test options especially weighs a lot more than the required because not hardly anyone's submitting test scores for some of these D3
Right.
especially.
Does any of that relate to coaches' fears that they'll bring a student on and the student will struggle academically and not make it, or is there something else to it?
I think it's more about this is another kind of feather in our cap we can use when talking to the admission office because they say,
Right.
oh, with grade inflation being the way it is, oh, everyone has a 4.0 now, but not everyone has a 33 ACT.
That's
So
right.
you just brought something up that I've always thought about in your sort of suggesting. Do coaches try to sell athletes they want to the admissions office? Like how much weight or sway doesn't a coach have in saying, look, I really want this kid. How do we make that happen?
Yes. Long story short, yes, they do. And how this occurs is for the pre-read form, there is oftentimes a field for coach rating, right? So when I was at F&M, we had, I think it was three different tiers. So a one rating was an immediate starter, so your top recruits. Two was impact player, which is kind of your standard kind of role player, and three is kind of depth player filling out the roster. So coaches can have that rating attributed. But then when I was also the liaison, I would request, and most of them acknowledged it and did it, others didn't do it at all, is give me a list of your overall recruit kind of in preference order, top to bottom recruits, but also by position or for like swimming and track by events. So we can have a sense of, oh, I'm not giving seven likely pre-reads to lacrosse goalies, right? You only have one
Right.
of those. So you don't have that oversaturation of the roster at the expense of the rest of the recruiting class.
And one other question, how often do you think it happens where a coach signals an affinity for a player, and yet that student might really not be as much in consideration as the coach may be signaling to that student?
It happens. And some sports more than others, I think it's for the ones that have trouble kind of getting the strongest academic kids, they have to make that athletic pitch. But then at the end of the day, I can look at a couple of years down the road. Oh, he or she labeled all the recruits ones, but none of them are playing on the team right now. They're on the bench. So that's unfortunately after the fact, but if you can bring that up with some evidence, you can say, okay, just be honest with us. We know it's not possible for you to have every single recruit you're bringing in being an immediate starter. If you were, you'd be winning a national championship every year. So having that relationship possibly with admissions and athletics allows you to be a bit more blunt in those conversations, as opposed to kind of walking on eggshells with coaches and the admission officers too.
There is so much that goes on behind the scenes that
Yeah.
people don't know, right? And that conversation, that constant communication between the admissions office and the athletic office is really something. What is one final piece of information or advice you would share specifically for students and families and counselors looking to play at the D3 or the Ivy League or the Patriot level?
Yeah, so probably the first way is to understand how to engage with coaches and admission offices, right? So from the athletics coaches specific piece, on the website, on the athletics website, there's usually a recruit questionnaire form for every sport. You fill it out, that puts you in their system. Then you can follow up with a individualized email to the head coach, and for bigger schools, the recruitment coordinator. So that's probably the first piece of advice for the communication standpoint. But when it comes time to apply, don't give the admission officers more reasons to think, oh, you're applying as an athlete. You're applying as a student who wants to play the sport at the respective school. That means avoiding as many sports essays as possible, make sure
Right.
your extracurricular list is diverse in terms of leadership and involvement, because you're being reviewed, your application is being reviewed not by the liaison in most cases, it's being reviewed by your territory manager. It could be either by geographic area or by major or college within the university. And most of those folks have no background in athletics, and some of them don't really even care and might even be hostile towards athletics. It's just because of those perceived misconceptions about the applicant athletics versus not. So don't give them any more reasons to, I guess, further that misconception by having a lackluster essay or making sure, oh, this is another lacrosse player, another basketball player. We want to say, oh, this is a great student athlete from state X or state Y that wants to place your sport at the school. Make it more of a holistic application than just have it a one-dimensional one.
That is fantastic. Matt, I know that we could talk with you about this topic all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so the best way to kind of start the conversation is through my website. It's arantacademicplanning.com.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Tests and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.